My brother took his own life. My brother passed away today. It was our mother who found him. After years of battling depression, heartache, self-doubt, and betrayal from people he trusted, he finally reached his breaking point. It took one shot, one small bullet, to end a lifetime of suffering. I walked into the house, hearing the heart-wrenching screams from our mother. I bolted up the stairs and into his room. There she was, holding him, pleading for him to breathe. The blood, my God, the blood, was everywhere. It splattered across the wall behind them, almost like some sort of dark art, a deep red stain on the old, worn-out white wall. It almost looked like an unfinished painting. His blood covered our mother. She cradled his lifeless body, screaming over and over, "Breathe. Please breathe." It did not take long for the ambulance and police to show up. They had to pull our mother away from him. She just would not let go, as if by holding him close, she could somehow stop his soul from leaving. I ended up talking to the officers for what seemed like forever. They took my mother to the hospital. She was in shock. It did not take long for them to rule out foul play, especially with only his fingerprints on the gun. I was strangely numb to the whole thing. He was my brother, and I loved him, but I felt nothing in that moment. Was it shock? Or maybe guilt? I am still not sure. I came back home that night and decided to sleep on the couch downstairs. I just could not walk past his room yet. I tried to sleep, but after a long day of feeling nothing, something finally hit me. It was not sadness or anger, it was fear. I was alone in the house, and upstairs, in his room, I could hear footsteps pacing back and forth. I woke up early the next morning to the sound of loud knocking on the door. Somehow, I had managed to sleep, even through the fear. I ignored the knocking for a moment and listened for any noise upstairs. Nothing. I pushed the memory of last night's footsteps out of my mind. A nightmare, I convinced myself. It had been a long, horrible day after all. I walked to the door and peeked through the peephole. Damn, I muttered under my breath. It was her. My brother's ex-girlfriend. I was not ready to face her, but I opened the door anyway. She just stood there, tears filling her eyes. I gave her that look, the look that said, "Yes, it is true." She broke down in tears. I do not know if it was seeing her cry, but that was the moment I finally cried too. We held each other and wept right there at the doorway, for what felt like forever. Eventually, she stopped and looked at me, her eyes still wet. I motioned for her to come inside, and we walked over to the couch. We sat in silence, side by side, lost in our own thoughts. Then, she finally said it, the thing I had been thinking all day. "You know this is our fault." "We killed him," she said, her voice shaking. "No," I said at last. "We messed up, sure, but we did not kill him. We did not put the gun to his head and pull the damn trigger. That was him." "We might as well have," she whispered. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "he struggled with this his whole life. He is the one who gave up. He is the one who made that choice. He is the one who quit." "How can you say that?" she asked, horrified. "Because it is the truth." I snapped. "We all suffered. I suffered. You suffered. That is life. He is the one who chose to walk away from it all. That is what a coward does." I shouted. She sat there quietly for a moment before speaking again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can call him a coward all you want, but that does not change what we did to him. It does not change the fact that we hurt someone who loved us," she said softly. My mind flashed back to that night, just days before he ended it all. She had been fighting with him again, and he stormed out of the house in anger. When I got home, she was sitting in the kitchen, crying. Great, another fight, I thought to myself. She looked up at me, tears in her eyes, and said, "It is over." I had always loved her, ever since we were kids. But my brother did what I never had the courage to do, he went after her. I was always too afraid to make a move. And deep down, I resented him for that. I never said it out loud, but I think he knew how I felt about her. That night, seeing her so broken, tore me apart. I just wanted to comfort her, to let her know things would be okay, that her world had not completely fallen apart. Somehow, we ended up in my room. I knew it was wrong, but I could not stop myself. I had dreamed of this moment for so long. That night, I felt something I had never felt before. I had been with other women, but nothing compared to being with her. That night, I finally understood what it meant to truly love someone. I realized, to my dismay, that I was not just in love with her, I had always been in love with her. We fell asleep together, her arms around me. And that is when our biggest mistake happened. The next morning, I woke up with her still lying naked beside me. But when I looked up, my heart dropped. My brother was standing at the foot of the bed, staring at me. His face was blank, emotionless. His eyes were hollow, drained of any life. He looked like a ghost. She stayed with me the rest of that day. We barely spoke, both of us still trying to process that he was really gone. My mind would not stop racing, no matter how hard I tried to calm it down. I felt a whirlwind of emotions, first sorrow, then anger, and even a hint of happiness. Not because he was gone, but because she was there with me. And that made me hate myself. I hated him. I hated the world. I wanted to burn it all down. She left in the afternoon, needing to go home. We had his service scheduled for the next morning. Once again, I was alone. Later, I decided to visit the hospital to check on my mom. Thankfully, she had moved past the shock and was now just grieving. We sat together and cried. "It is no one's fault, Mom. He always had his struggles," I whispered. "I know, but I keep wondering if we could have done more, maybe we didn't do enough," she replied, her voice trembling. "Mom, he is gone. Nothing will change that. We have to accept it. He is not coming back." She hesitated, then broke down again. My baby is gone." I stayed with her as she cried. There was nothing I could say to make her feel better, not yet. So I just sat there in silence. I got back home around 2 in the morning, feeling uneasy about being alone again. Would I hear the footsteps tonight? I sat on the couch, still avoiding going upstairs. The silence was thick, but it was better than the alternative. I let out a sigh of relief, telling myself it was all in my head. I got comfortable on the couch, slowly drifting off to sleep. But just before I slipped into unconsciousness, I heard a faint whisper, clear as day. "Do you really think I am a coward?" The day of the funeral arrived, and I could barely breathe. The room was filled with family, old friends, and even some faces I did not recognize. But the only person I could focus on was her. The sorrow in the room was overwhelming, yet I could not bring myself to cry with everyone else. I felt like I was suffocating, like a weight was pressing down on my chest. She noticed and took my hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I know it hurts, but I am here with you," she said softly. I forced a smile, but she had no idea what I was really going through. No one in that room did. I started sweating, my breathing becoming more and more labored. The others thought I was just mourning my brother. They had no clue. Finally, I could not take it anymore. "Are you all blind?" I yelled. "Can none of you see it?" The room fell silent as everyone stared at me in confusion. That is when I realized the awful truth. I was completely alone in this. None of them could see what I was seeing. My brother, my dead brother, was standing right next to his casket. He was smiling at me. Weeks passed after the funeral, and I had not left the house since. I just could not. She came over one day, bringing groceries. "I know it has been tough for you, but you have to try to move on," she said gently. "Come outside with me, let us take a walk." I stayed silent, and I could see the frustration building in her eyes. "Look," she said after a long pause. "You are not the one who died. He is gone. And the last thing he would have wanted is for you to lock yourself away and slowly waste away." He would want you to keep living. I was about to respond when he interrupted. She is wrong, my brother said, his voice cold and distant. I do not want you to move on. I want you to suffer the way you made me suffer. You are the reason I am dead. You are the reason I am in agony, even in death. I cannot rest. And neither will you. I just stared at him, powerless. His face was so pale, his brown eyes lifeless. There was a hole in the side of his head where the bullet had entered. And he was smiling, that same unnatural, ear-to-ear smile. What had started as footsteps in the night had become a living nightmare, one I could not escape. He was always there, always smiling at me. Every morning, I would wake up hoping he was gone, but he was always there to greet me with a simple, "Hello, brother." I could not take it anymore. I am sorry. I never meant to hurt you, I sobbed. I loved you. Do not apologize, you did not hurt me, she replied. She thought I was talking to her. Of course, she had no idea my brother was right there. How could she know? He was invisible to her. I took a deep breath, looked her in the eyes, and said, I need help. I think I have been hallucinating. It has been 3 weeks since I checked into the hospital. They have me on all kinds of medication, but none of it seems to work. I am starting to get frustrated. He is still here, always watching, always smiling that cold, lifeless smile. Whenever the doctors come in, he stands right next to them, like he is mocking me. It is never easy losing someone to suicide, my therapist tells me during one of our sessions. It can make you feel like you are to blame, but you need to understand that this was not your fault. You need to let go of the guilt, and once you do, these hallucinations will stop. My brother was standing next to her, nodding his head in this sarcastic, mocking way, grinning like he was in on the joke. 2 more weeks went by, and still no change. More pills, more therapy sessions, but he never left. He was always there. His appearance was getting worse by the day. His face had started decaying, the skin peeling away on one side, hanging like old, loose fabric. His teeth, once yellow, had turned black and rotted. His eyes were now completely dark, no longer brown, no white left at all. But the worst part? The smile. He never stopped smiling, that horrible, twisted grin. Look at me, look at what you did to me, he laughed. I am sorry, I am so sorry, I sobbed. If you really mean it, then make it right, he said, his voice icy and hollow. How? I asked, even though I already knew what he meant. End our torment, brother. I curled up in my hospital bed and cried until I finally fell asleep. The next morning, I checked myself out. Since I admitted myself, they could not force me to stay. They had their chance, but their pills did not help. That afternoon, I found myself standing in front of 2 large bronze doors. My brother was now barely recognizable. He looked like a corpse that had been dug up after weeks in the ground. Half of his jaw was missing flesh, exposing his rotten black teeth and the bones underneath. The skin on his head had peeled away, leaving his skull visible with just a few strands of hair. His exposed skull still showed the bullet hole where the end began. And yet, through it all, he was still smiling, that same awful grin. You cannot get rid of me like this, he said. There is only one way. Please, set us free. I ignored him and pushed open the heavy doors. Gathering all the courage I could muster, I walked inside and approached the priest. I told him everything, about my brother's suicide, and how he haunted me day and night. Is he here now? The priest asked. Yes, I replied quietly. He is standing right beside you. The priest glanced around, clearly uncomfortable, though he could not see what I saw. Please, I do not know what else to do, I begged him. I will do my best to help you, he said, but you must put all your faith in God. You must believe without a single doubt. Surrender yourself to him, and he will guide you to salvation. My brother let out a mocking laugh. Surrender, he sneered. Sounds to me like he wants you to sell your soul. I ignored him, focusing on the priest. This does not sound like a possession, the priest continued. So, an exorcism will not work. Besides, we would need approval from the church for that, and it could take weeks. So what do we do? I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. We pray, the priest said firmly. Pray to God for his protection, and to drive away any evil spirits. We can start with the Lord's Prayer. Do you know it? I nodded. My brother was furious now. You cannot do this to me. I am your brother, he yelled. We started the prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. As soon as the priest began, my brother let out a scream, not one of anger but pure agony. The priest kept going, his voice steady, while I stood there with my eyes shut tight, praying this would finally end it, that I would be rid of him for good. My brother's screams pierced the air, high-pitched and terrible, as if he was burning alive. You already killed me, and now you want to make me suffer even more? Please, brother, it burns. It burns so much, he screamed. The sound of his suffering was like nothing I had ever heard. It was a cry of pain beyond what any person could inflict. I squeezed my eyes shut harder, fighting the urge to open them. He was still my brother, and hearing him like this tore me apart, but I needed to be free. I needed relief. Against my better judgment, I opened my eyes, and the sight before me was horrifying. My brother's rotting flesh was on fire, burning off his body at an agonizingly slow pace. His screams only grew louder as I watched the flames consume him, flesh melting away until it exposed the bone beneath. The priest continued his prayer, though he looked at me with growing concern. I kept my focus on my brother, now little more than charred bones, but even they were blackening and turning to ash before my eyes. He took one step toward me, but as his foot touched the floor, it crumbled into ash, and the rest of him collapsed to the ground. His skull remained, staring at me, and his hand reached out as if to grab me. Then, with one final breath, the bones disintegrated, leaving nothing behind but dust. Just like that, he was gone. The room was silent now. The priest had stopped praying. All I could hear was my own labored breathing, quick and panicked. Finally, the priest spoke, his voice calm but with a slight tremor that betrayed his fear. It is over. You should go home, he said. I could tell he was trying to hide it, but there was no mistaking the way his voice shook. He was afraid, not of what had just happened, but of me. Why would he be afraid of me? I took one last look at him and then at the floor where my brother had vanished. Without saying another word, I turned and walked out of the church. As I made my way home, I could hardly believe it was really over. The nightmare that had tormented me for so long had finally come to an end. And yet, so many questions still lingered in my mind. What had caused all this? Was that really my brother? And where is he now? But in that moment, none of it mattered. All I cared about was that it was done. I decided it was time to face what I had been avoiding for so long. I needed to go to his room and clean up the mess he left behind. I took a deep breath as I approached the door, bracing myself for the sight of dried blood and the horror of that night. But what I found was far worse than I could have ever imagined. There, sitting at the end of the bed, was my brother, grinning at me with that cold, familiar smile. You cannot get rid of me, he said. I know, I replied. The only way this ends is if you make it right. I know, I whispered. So do what you have to do. I will, brother, I said quietly. I picked up the phone and called her. I told her I was struggling, that I was hurting, and I did not want to be alone. She came over right away, just like I knew she would. I let her in and thanked her for coming. She sat on the couch, facing away from me, and I stood behind her, knowing what I had to do to make things right. My hands shook as I raised the gun, but I knew there was no other way. Slowly, I pulled the trigger. She collapsed onto the couch without a sound. My brother stood beside her body, his smile wider now. Almost there, brother. I glanced down at her lifeless form, and then back at him. There was only one way to finish this, only one way to make right what had been done. I placed the gun in my mouth. For the first time in a long while, I felt no fear, no panic, just cold, like my brother. My thoughts drifted to my mother, to the choices I had made that led me here. And with my eyes closed, I squeezed the trigger.